So as I said there, we're hoping for a little bit of a tutorial during this session. I hope that's okay. Let's start with the big question. What is realism in international relations?
Realism is a theory of international politics. It's a theory about how the world works that says that states care more than anything else about the balance of power. This is not to say they don't have other interests. It's not to say that states sometimes can't behave in idealistic ways. But when push comes to shove, it's the balance of power that matters the most to states, and states want to make sure that they have lots of power and that their potential adversaries have as little power as possible. And the principal reason for this is because in the international system, there is no higher authority. There's no ultimate arbiter. There's no Leviathan that can come to the rescue of states if they get into trouble. If you are a state and you're weak and a more powerful state comes after you, you can't turn to a higher authority to rescue you because there is no higher authority. The system is not hierarchic. It's anarchic in the sense that it's flat. And in a world like that, you have to take care of yourself. It's what we call in international relations lingo, it's a self-help world. And what you want to do in that self-help world is be as powerful as possible, because if you're really powerful, it's highly unlikely that anyone will attack you. Now, what this means in terms of liberal values, in terms of idealism, is that there are going to be cases where an idealistic policy lines up with a realist policy. Defeating Adolf Hitler in World War II makes sense from a strategic point of view, from a realist point of view. There's no question about that. The United States does not want Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich to dominate Europe for good realist reasons. At the same reason, it makes perfect sense from a liberal point of view or from an idealistic point of view to want to defeat Adolf Hitler for reasons I don't have to explain to you. So in that case, right, the two approaches go together. The question is, what happens when the arrows point in different directions? And realism calls for pursuing a ruthless foreign policy, and liberalism does not. Which of the two approaches wins out? And the answer from a realist point of view is that realism would dominate. And the reason is because realism is really all about survival. Realism is predicated on the assumption that survival is the highest goal that a state can have. And therefore, if survival is the highest goal, that means realism will trump idealistic logic. And by the way, Freddie, it will also trump economic logic if the two are in conflict. And just to give you a good example that highlights this, that really, I think, illustrates what realism is all about. Once China becomes a great power, we're talking roughly 2017, and it is seen by the United States as a peer competitor. The United States has a vested interest in making sure that it has much more power than China has. The United States wants to check the growth of China as a great power and accelerate its own growth so that the power gap between the two countries is as great as possible in favor of the Americans. But what this means is that the United States is going to have to pursue economic policies that are going to hurt the United States economically. A lot of people say to me, John, if we get tough with the Chinese, as we are now doing economically, it's going to damage the United States. It's going to hurt the American economy. It's going to slow down American economic growth. My response to that is, that's true. But that's the price you have to pay to make sure that you can contain China. So you see the economic arrow and the realist arrow are pointing in opposite directions.
So is it an amoral school? Is it that you are observing the way the world actually works and that there is merit in being truthful and realistic in observing those dynamics? Or do realists actually think there is moral value in survival and your first duty is to your own citizens and therefore it is kind of morally acceptable to pursue self-interest ruthlessly?
I would make the argument that it is an amoral, and very important to emphasize, I'm not saying immoral. It is an amoral theory. And we all have moral compasses in our head, and those moral compasses influence how we think about the world, just the way realism does. And as I said, when they're in conflict, the realist compass, so to speak, dominates the moral compass. But realism by itself, in my opinion, is an amoral theory. Now, some people argue that it's not, and you were going down this road, which is not to say you believe this, but one could argue that survival is the highest goal of a state, and it is a virtuous or morally correct goal. And therefore, anything you do to enhance your survival is morally correct. I think if you make that argument, a great power can go out and behave in the most incredibly ruthless ways, and you can defend it as morally correct because it is facilitating that great power's survival. And I think if you go down that road, then it's hard to distinguish moral behavior from immoral behavior or ethical from unethical behavior. And I think that's kind of not the way to go.
So it's more a theory of the way the world actually works than any kind of hope of the way the world should work.
Well, it is the way the world works. And my argument is reflected in my most important book, where I lay out my realist theory. It's called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And I think this is a tragic situation. I think the structure of the international system forces states, forces great powers especially, whether it's the United States, Germany, Japan, China, the Soviet Union, Russia. It forces great powers to act in ruthless ways. They have no choice, because in a world where there is no higher authority and another state may attack you, you have a vested interest, a profound interest in making sure you're powerful. And sometimes that requires doing ruthless things. And I think this is a tragic situation.
So if those people who started listening are still with us and it hasn't got too theoretical for them, I'm guessing a lot of people might be thinking, I guess maybe I'm a little bit of a realist. A lot of people were very disappointed by the misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, that whole sense of kind of liberal interventionism, this fantasy that we were going to impose democracy all around the world. That was a sort of unrealistic worldview and doesn't feel very popular anymore. And a lot of people are also pretty skeptical about overarching international institutions, such as the UN, having much influence these days. So if you're listening to this and feeling, this is beginning to align with my worldview, do you think those kinds of issues are likely to make you a realist with a small r, at least, a civilian realist?
Yeah, I think you're right. What happened here, in my opinion, Freddie, is that when the Cold War ended, and then when the Soviet Union collapses in December of 2001, we move into what is usually called the unipolar moment. And that means there's only one great power on the planet, and that's the United States of America, which is incredibly powerful. And in a very important way, realism gets put in the back closet or gets put on the back burner because there's no more great power competition. The United States does not have to worry about the balance of power because it's so incredibly powerful. So what the United States does during the unipolar moment, because it's a thoroughly liberal state, is it pursues a liberal foreign policy. It's, in the first time in its history, free to put aside realist concerns and behave in a very liberal way. And of course, the British, or Britain, which is another thoroughly liberal country, becomes part of a tag team with the United States, and the British and the Americans run around the world trying to spread liberal values, sometimes at the end of a rifle barrel. And what happened is that we produced one failure after another. This turned out to be a disastrous foreign policy. So what happens in 2017 with the coming of multipolarity, remember, in about 2017, you move from a unipolar world to a realist world. What roughly happens in 2017 is that realism is back for the United States because we're now in a multipolar world. There are great powers out there, China and Russia, to be specific. That's number one. But number two, what happens is that people understand that a liberal foreign policy, what I like to call liberal hegemony, our policy from roughly 2001 to 2017, has been, I think it's fair to say, a colossal failure. So people are much more sympathetic to realism starting in roughly 2017, moving forward, than they were during the unipolar moment. And of course, most people, and this includes people like you, grew up, came of age in the unipolar moment. So realism was something that was easy to be critical of, to dismiss during the unipolar moment. And most people in the liberal West were feeling really good about what liberalism could do. It was the Frank Fukuyama view of the world. What Frank said when the Cold War ended is that the future is liberalism. We liberals have the wind at our back, and what's going to happen is the world is going to become increasingly liberal. By 2017, that line of argument was not looking good. And today, that line of argument is in complete tatters. And when liberalism fails like that, and when you have two other great powers in the system, China and Russia, realism is going to make a comeback. And that's what we see happening here. So people are more sympathetic to realism for sure than they were in, let's say, 2000 or 2010.